Broadus wasn't looking for anything. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon, the kind where the house felt too quiet, and the light streamed in through the windows with no particular urgency. He wandered into his father's old study, a room he rarely entered. It had remained untouched since Snoop Dogg had moved most of his operations to another property. The room still smelled like leather-bound journals, faint incense and time, frozen in a moment that no one dared disturb. Corde brushed his hand along a dusty bookshelf, tracing names of authors he'd never known his father to read. Then his fingers paused on a book, half pulled from the shelf. The edges were worn. No flashy cover, no sign it was meant for display. He pulled it free and flipped it open with casual curiosity. A folded sheet of paper slipped from between the pages, fluttering to the hardwood floor. He hesitated before picking it up. The handwriting on the front was instantly recognizable, bold, fluid, familiar. "For Corde, when you're ready." He froze. A strange silence filled the room, heavy with questions. He unfolded the paper slowly, careful not to tear its fragile creases. The ink had faded just slightly, but every word stood clear. Dated July 2013. That was the year everything changed. Before we dive deeper into this emotional and life-changing journey, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real-life stories that leave a mark. Corde stood there, still holding the paper, as if reading it might set off something he couldn't control. He looked around the room, framed photos of Snoop with presidents, athletes, artists. His life was everywhere. But here, in this single letter, there was something different, something stripped down. Honest. He hadn't seen this note before. No one had ever mentioned it. Had his father placed it here intentionally? Was he meant to find it back then or now? It felt like the book had waited for this exact moment, for Corde to be old enough, maybe wise enough, to understand. He sat down on the old couch in the corner of the study. The leather groaned under him, as if waking from a long sleep. He read the first few lines, and already he felt something shift in his chest. But before we go further, who exactly was Corde Broadus? Most people only knew him as Snoop Dogg's son, a calm presence in the chaotic swirl of fame. He had the kind of quiet that made people listen when he finally spoke. A father of three, a man who carried a deep love for his children, but often struggled to articulate his own needs, his own fears. He'd spent much of his adult life trying not to ride the coattails of his father's legacy. It was never resentment. It was more like confusion. How do you define yourself when your name already comes with a story? This note, it wasn't supposed to exist in a world where their conversations were few and often incomplete. But here it was, a relic of a time when Corde was barely entering adulthood, when the distance between them was thick with misunderstanding and unsaid things. He hadn't spoken to his father deeply in months, not out of anger, just habit. They both seemed to drift through a rhythm of nods, "I'm good," and brief updates. But this note felt different. It wasn't casual, it wasn't light, and it wasn't something he could ignore. As he leaned back, the paper trembling in his fingers, he realized this was no ordinary Sunday. This was something else entirely, something that might change everything. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. Corde hadn't even finished reading it, just the opening lines, but already the air around him felt heavier. He stood, still holding the note, and walked slowly toward the window. July 2013. The date echoed in his mind like an old song lyric. That was the summer everything unraveled. He remembered the house being quieter than usual. His parents weren't fighting, but they weren't talking much either. That was also the year he moved out, fast, without much ceremony. He had just turned 19, full of pride, full of questions. No real direction, but an unshakable urge to figure it out on his own. And now here was this letter, hidden inside a book, waiting for a version of him that might only now exist. Corde sat back down and unfolded the note fully, smoothing out its creases with care. The handwriting was unmistakable. It started gently, without flourish. "Corde," it read, "I don't know when or if you'll ever find this, but I hope when you do, you'll be in a place where my words can reach you." He stopped reading. That line alone pierced something deep. His father wasn't the poetic type, not in their private life. Snoop spoke through rhythm and lyrics to the world, but with his son he'd always been more guarded, stern, sometimes silent. He debated setting the note aside. Maybe he wasn't ready. Maybe it was better not to know what came next. But he couldn't stop now. The next lines recalled a moment that Corde had almost forgotten. A beach day, long before the fame had really set in. Just the two of them, walking barefoot across warm sand. He must have been 6 or 7. "You asked me then if I was famous," the note read. "And I told you, not yet, but you're already somebody. You didn't understand what I meant back then. Maybe you still don't, but one day you'll see the man I see in you." Corde blinked hard. The words hit like a wave. He never knew his father had held that memory close. He barely remembered it himself, just fragments of ocean wind and laughter. He read on. "I wasn't always good at showing love. I grew up where showing too much got you hurt, so I stayed quiet. Too quiet. That's on me." Each line felt heavier than the last. Corde hadn't expected warmth. He hadn't expected any of this. What he found was not just a note, it was a voice frozen in time, finally speaking what years of silence had never allowed. He leaned back, arms resting on his knees, and stared at the floor. For years he'd told himself he was fine, that the distance between them was normal, even necessary, but now he questioned everything. A flood of memories surged, late-night texts that went unanswered, moments when he stood outside his father's dressing room, waiting for a word of praise that never came. Small things that stacked up quietly until they formed walls. He had carried that weight for years, quietly, without complaint. He hadn't cried in so long, he barely remembered what it felt like. Now, something inside him cracked. The note wasn't even finished, but it had already begun to unravel pieces of himself he hadn't dared to look at. It wasn't just a message, it was a mirror. And he wasn't sure he liked everything he saw. He folded the paper again, slowly, deliberately, as if closing it would give him space to breathe. But his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He stood in the middle of the study, surrounded by trophies and accolades, but for once none of that mattered. All that mattered was what he had just read, and what it had awakened inside him. He didn't sleep that night. Corde lay in bed, the note beside him on the nightstand. The house was still, dark, silent, except for the occasional creak of wood adjusting to the coolness of night. He had read the letter 3 more times, each pass peeling away another layer of guarded memory, of long-suppressed emotion. In the quiet, he replayed his father's words, especially one phrase that kept echoing. "I wasn't always good at showing love." It wasn't an excuse, it was a confession. And in its honesty, something broke open in Corde that he hadn't realized was sealed. He sat up before sunrise, unable to fight the pull of the letter. One more time, he read. The next part took him deeper. Snoop's handwriting stayed steady, but the words began to shift tone, less reflective, more revealing. "There was a moment," the letter read, "when I almost walked away from everything. It was after that fight we had, the night you told me I wasn't there for you." Corde remembered, vividly. They'd been standing in the driveway of the old house. He'd been 19, tired of being looked at like a boy, desperate to be heard. "You said I wasn't there," the letter continued. "And you were right. That truth broke me. I didn't know how to face it, so I buried it. I buried too many things." Corde felt his chest tighten. That night had haunted him for years, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. After the fight, his father had gone inside without a word. No apology, no confrontation, just silence. And Corde had learned to live with it, believing it was just the way things were. But now in his hands was proof that the silence wasn't indifference, it was pain. Pain neither of them knew how to speak through. The letter went on. "I thought being strong meant being distant. But strength without love is just fear in disguise. And I was afraid I wasn't enough for you, that I'd fail you the same way I felt failed growing up." Corde's throat tightened. His father, the icon, the legend, the unshakable presence on stage and screen, was writing about fear, doubt, vulnerability. He suddenly felt like a boy again, hearing his dad not as a larger-than-life figure, but as a man. A flawed, frightened, deeply human man. For the first time, Corde saw the possibility that maybe they had both been waiting for each other to speak first. He rubbed his face, exhaling slowly. The weight of those words settled into him. He realized how many years he'd spent with a quiet resentment, building a life around what he assumed was permanent distance. He had measured himself against silence, not truth. And now the truth stared back at him from a single page. He looked around the room, the faint light of morning now stretching across the floorboards. Everything seemed the same, but he wasn't. The letter wasn't finished, but already it had stirred something deep, a reckoning he hadn't known he needed. He folded it once more, his movements slower now, more reverent. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what to do next. But one thing was clear. The man who had written that letter wasn't the myth or the stage persona. He was a father who had tried, failed, and still wanted to be heard, still wanted to be seen. And now, Corde was finally ready to listen. Corde sat in silence for what felt like hours. The letter, now folded and resting in his lap, had become something sacred, both an artifact and a mirror. Every word, every line etched in his memory. He didn't need to reread it anymore, it had carved itself into him. He reached for his phone, then paused. This wasn't something to text. It wasn't even something to say face to face, at least not yet. He needed to speak freely without the weight of an immediate reaction. So he opened the camera and began recording. Not for the world, not for an audience, just for his father. At first he couldn't find the words. He stared at the screen, expression blank, breathing shallow. Then slowly, he began to speak. "I found your note." His voice cracked on the first sentence. He swallowed hard and tried again. "I wasn't looking for it, it was there. And I read it. All of it." He paused, hands shaking slightly. He looked down, then back up. "I don't know what you expected me to feel, but I wasn't ready for how much it hit me. I didn't know you remembered that beach day. I didn't know you kept that night in the driveway with you. I thought you forgot. Or worse, I thought you didn't care." Tears welled up and he didn't bother wiping them away. He let them fall, unfiltered, raw. "Now you said I was right when I said you weren't there. But you didn't just leave after that night. I did too. I stopped trying. I buried everything under pride and silence and told myself it was fine. But it wasn't." Another pause. His breathing slowed, then deepened. "I wish I had heard this from you sooner. I wish I had said something back then. But I get it now. You were scared. And I was angry. And between fear and anger, we built a wall that neither of us wanted to admit was there." The room felt heavy again, but different this time. It was the weight of truth, finally spoken aloud. He exhaled shakily. "I don't want to keep that wall up anymore." Just then the door creaked open behind him. His younger brother stepped in, hesitating when he saw Corde wiping tears from his eyes. "So you good?" he asked softly. Corde nodded, but his voice betrayed him. "I found a letter from Dad from years ago." Without another word, his brother sat beside him. Corde unfolded the paper once more and handed it over. He watched as his brother's expression shifted, first confusion, then stillness. Neither of them spoke as he finished reading. They just sat there, two sons holding their father's words, like a fragile truth between them. Eventually, his brother said, "You should show him the video." Corde hesitated. "It wasn't meant to be seen. I just needed to say it. But he needs to hear it." He nodded slowly. Maybe he was right. What they didn't know, what neither of them could have predicted, was that a family friend who had walked past the open door moments earlier had seen a glimpse of the recording. Moved by the vulnerability, they thought they were doing the right thing. The video was shared, and within hours it was everywhere. Millions watched Corde's voice tremble, his eyes welling with tears, as he read and responded to a letter that had been meant for no one else. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't rehearsed, it was real. And in that rawness, the internet stopped. For once, it wasn't about spectacle or scandal. It was about a son, a father, and a note that waited years to be heard. The video had already reached over 3 million views by the next morning. Corde's phone buzzed non-stop, but he hadn't checked a single message. He hadn't posted anything, hadn't responded to anyone. The video wasn't meant to be shared, and now it was everywhere. Still, deep inside, he couldn't feel anger, just disbelief. The world had seen him cry. They had seen him speak truths he'd buried for a decade, and instead of judgment, the reaction had been something unexpected. Waves of support, empathy, and reflection. People from around the globe commented about their own fathers, about forgiveness, about letters they never sent. But none of that mattered as much as the one message he hadn't yet received. And then his phone rang. He stared at the screen. Dad. He answered, slowly bringing the phone to his ear. For a second, neither spoke, just breathing, just presence. Then came the words, quiet, cracked, and barely above a whisper. I saw it. Corde closed his eyes. Yeah? I didn't know it was still in the book, his father said. I wrote it and thought maybe, I don't know. That it'd find you when you were ready. Corde's voice was thick. I think I was. Another long pause. I'm proud of you, son, Snoop said, voice trembling. Not for the views, not for how you spoke, but for feeling it, for finally letting it come out. Corde swallowed hard. I didn't know I needed to. You did, and so did I. There was no fanfare, no elaborate explanation. Just two men, two voices finally aligned, not in volume but in depth. They talked for nearly an hour about things they'd never said, about the silence between them, about the years they could never get back, and the ones still ahead. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Later that evening, Corde walked into his son's room. He sat at the edge of the bed and watched him sleep. Small breaths, little fists curled near his cheeks, innocent, whole. In that moment, Corde made a decision. He went to his study, pulled out a journal, and began to write. Not a reflection, not a monologue, a letter. To my son, he wrote, so that one day, if ever you feel far from me, these words will bring you back. The cycle ends here, he thought. The silence stops with me. He didn't know if the video would fade from the internet in a week or become something people would remember for years. That part didn't matter. What mattered was what it sparked, not in the world, but in his home, in his family, in his own heart. He folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it gently in a drawer, just in case, just so it would be there when it needed to be. He didn't need to say more, because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about grand moments. They're about finding the courage to open a door, speak a truth, and let love finally fill the space that silence once claimed. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and be part of this community of human stories that matter. And before you go, click the video on your screen to hear another powerful tale of redemption and connection.